Surprise, surprise, Ubisoft has put its foot in it once again. Now, you might remember last year when Ubisoft was in hot water for telling its fans that they should get comfortable with not owning their games. Well, they're back on their BS once again, this time in the pages of a lawsuit. Now, last year, Polygon reported that a lawsuit had been filed against the company from two Californian gamers over the closure and discontinuation of The Crew. It was leveled on the basis that Ubisoft took away a product that these people had paid for, rendering it completely useless. Because The Crew is always online, it meant that once they pulled the servers, there was no way to access a game that many people had paid for all the way back in 2014. The lawsuit described the behavior as being, quote, "Imagine you buy a pinball machine and years later you enter your den to go play it, only to discover that all the paddles are missing, the pinball and the bumpers are gone, and the monitor that proudly displayed your unassailable high score is removed. Turns out the pinball manufacturer decided to come into your home, gut the insides of the pinball machine, and remove your ability to play the game that you bought and thought you owned." This idea that players bought a game and expected it to function in the long term, whether it was billed as an online game or not, has been a topic of conversation since the lawsuit was filed. And that's because, as Polygon and others note, The Crew didn't get a patch before it was shut down to add an offline mode in it. Other games that have had a similar always online component before the servers have been shut off have been patched to be playable without those servers up and running to honor the purchase that people made. Ubisoft was always going to fight against this lawsuit, and in a recent Polygon article, they got their hands on their counter filing to get the case thrown out of court, where they argued that, quote, "The essence of the plaintiff's complaint is that Ubisoft allegedly misled purchasers of its video game The Crew into believing they were purchasing unfettered ownership rights in the game rather than a limited license to access the game. But the reality is that consumers received the benefit of their bargain and were explicitly notified at the time of purchase they were purchasing a license." After making their purchases, plaintiffs enjoyed access to The Crew for years before Ubisoft decided in late 2023 to retire and shut down the servers of the 10-year-old video game. Plaintiffs received the benefit of their bargain and cannot complain now that they were deceived simply because Ubisoft did not then create an offline version of the discontinued video game. And that's pretty much it in black and white. That's Ubisoft saying, yeah, you have never owned these games, whether you got them through a subscription or bought them outright. You have only ever paid to access a license of those games. Now, it's important to note that this isn't the only reaction to The Crew shutting down. It's not just these two people who have filed this lawsuit, as Games Radar notes that there has been a campaign launched against Ubisoft about killing its games off in this way by turning off the servers and not adding in an offline mode to allow players to continue to access the title. Now, do I think the lawsuit is going to get thrown out? Probably, and even if it doesn't, I think it'll be a tough one for the people bringing it to Ubisoft to win. I think Ubisoft probably has a leg to stand on somewhere in terms of its terms and conditions and whatnot. But does that mean I think they're in the right? Absolutely not. In fact, I think some of the wording in this filing is just a little bit condescending on the whole. Obviously, it's always going to be quite cut and dry with it being legalese and the reaction to a very serious lawsuit if it would go through that could cost them a lot of money. But I worry that it reveals a little bit too much about how Ubisoft and their lawyers think of its players and of its own games. And that's because while in the modern day where we have these disclaimers that you aren't buying, as they call it, unfettered access to ownership of a game and you are just buying a license, I think you can't really overstate how different the gaming landscape is now in 2025. And that's because while, yeah, now I think that publishers are way more open, as we've seen with Ubisoft last year, complaining that players need to get to grips with the fact that they won't own their games going forward, that we are more or less buying a license and we don't have ownership of a thing, even if we buy a box copy of a game. There have been some regulations that have been brought in certain territories to make that clearer than ever. And with the messaging out of these studios, it's still not great, but it's much different than it was back in 2014 when The Crew launched. And I don't think you can overstate just how different 2014 was compared to 2025 when it comes to the video game landscape. Yeah, we had always online titles back then, but this was still an era where box sales were a major part of the market. We hadn't completely moved to digital like we kinda have now. This was before gaming subscriptions really kicked off as they are now with the likes of Game Pass or PlayStation Plus. Before we had this understanding and this acknowledgement that through those services, we'll be buying a license to access those games in the same way that we do for Netflix or we do for Spotify. All of this was really young, and I do think it's fair that back then there was an expectation that if you bought a game like The Crew, even one that was online, you'd still be able to play it in some form. Yeah, we understand that servers get turned off. Not everything that is an online game involved with that online game will last forever, but usually you get to play a version of the game still. You don't just put it in the console and have it not work. And even on top of that, we have seen, like I mentioned before, other games of a similar ilk patch in offline modes so that the game still functions in a certain way. And even outside of players feeling like they've gotten the short end of the stick by buying a game like this, then having it not work 10 years later, I just think overall this is a pretty rubbish way to treat games as art and as things and as products. Yeah, okay, The Crew wasn't the best game ever made, but we do lose something as an industry and hell, as a culture, if we just make those games inaccessible in any form. You are literally losing an artistic product that was made and a part of history. You might argue that games are different to music or films or TV or whatever it is, but I just think it's a shame that you can have these products, again, these artistic works of art that people have put their blood, sweat, and tears in for years at a time to create, and then just have them disappear from the face of the earth. And I think this is even more egregious than something like Spec Ops: The Line being pulled from sale or discontinued. At least then you have a second-hand market, and don't get me wrong, it's not great. You shouldn't have to pay inflated prices to play something like Spider-Man Web of Shadows or something as seminal as Silent Hill 1 or Silent Hill 2. But the fact of the matter remains that if you can get your hands on those rare games, you can put them in a console and it'll work. You won't reach this blockade. With something like The Crew, it's kind of a different story, because if you do go out of your way to track down a copy and then try to play it, you just can't. And I don't want to use this platform to fearmonger or anything like that, but that worries me in our modern climate, a climate that is so based around digital distribution and services like Game Pass and like PlayStation Plus. Both of those services I genuinely like. I have been championing them on this channel and on this podcast for a long, long time. But the point is they're good for right now, and I don't necessarily trust many of these companies to have, say, an exclusive on Game Pass or on PlayStation Plus or what have you, and have the forethought and have the preservation of that game in mind to keep it around when the servers are turned off. It's the same with digital purchases, like I said, which take up the bulk of game sales these days. The majority of my gaming library right now is digital, and I'm kind of just trying not to think about a future where all of those can just disappear because I don't have them physical and able to be popped into a console like I do my collection of PlayStation 2 games or PlayStation 1 games that have no current digital distribution to access them on modern consoles. And what sucks is that this is kind of exactly what these companies want. They want to move away from the older models of you buy a game and you own it. Now, even if you do buy physical and you do try to future-proof yourself in this way, there is no guarantee that you'll be able to do so. And that's not just talking about something like The Crew when it has its servers pulled and its online mode be unavailable going forward. This is also about game discs essentially becoming game keys that don't actually have any data on them and only serve to pop in your console to activate a digital download. Nintendo has recently taken flack with that, with the announcement of some Switch 2 games operating in the same way, where there isn't actually the game or the full game on the cartridge itself, and you're going to need some kind of download to complete it, to be able to play the thing that you bought physically. That is not uncommon anymore. Sometimes you just buy a game box and it'll have a code in it. It won't even have the pretense of having a disc or anything like that. Companies, obviously, because they get a little bit more money if they distribute digitally and they don't have to pay those third-party retailers and whatnot, they want this move to a digital future, a more accessible future for them and a more beneficial future for them. And there's absolutely pluses to that method, don't get me wrong. I just worry about the longevity of it. I wonder about, in the current climate where we're seeing so many layoffs and we're seeing so many studio closures, I'm worried about the upkeep of these games. I'm worried about them being accessible in the long run. And yeah, I'm kind of worried about the fact that we don't really own anything anymore. It's kind of weird. But sadly, it seems like this mentality is here to stay, at least for right now, with publishers, including Ubisoft, doubling down on the idea that we as gamers should get comfortable not owning our games.